the session that we're not able to attend today. Okay, good morning and welcome to MassDEP's third technical session this week on the Massachusetts Clean Heat Standard. My name is Christine Kirby. I am MassDEP's Assistant Commissioner of the Bureau of Air and Waste. And joining me today from the agency are Will Space, Emily Lamb, and Josh Cook. They are all of the Bureau of Air and Waste Climate Strategies Group. Next slide. Thank you. Many of you may have joined us on one of our virtual community meetings a week ago Monday. This week we are holding 3 technical sessions on the Clean Heat Standard, and we will cover 6 topics. We have already held 2 of those on Monday and Tuesday. And for today, we will cover measure verification and MassDEP coordination. The slides are up on our website that you are seeing here, so you can go back and look at them after the call. This is our last technical session this week on the topics listed on this slide. We want to note we are very interested in and encourage your feedback on what we are covering today. Encourage any comments going forward. Comments may be submitted to our climate strategies email. That's at the end of this presentation. I'm now going to turn to Emily to cover meeting logistics.
Yes, thanks. So as Christine mentioned, this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on our website. We've muted all of the attendees to minimize background noise. And we'd ask that you enter your name and affiliation if relevant in the participants panel, which you can do by clicking on the participants icon. And then next to your name, there are 3 little dots that you can hover over and select rename. Next slide. So there will be opportunities to participate in this meeting, to ask questions and provide comments. So if you would like to ask a question or provide a comment, we'd ask that you use the raise your hand function, which you can again find in the participants panel on the bottom right where it says raise hand. When it's your turn to speak, we'll notify you and ask you to unmute. You can also submit questions through the question and answer box at the bottom if you don't wish to speak. And with that, I'll turn it back to Christine.
Thank you, Emily. For our topics today, the agenda for parts 1 and 2 is to provide some background on the issue. We also want to give you a summary of the comments we received on these issues. And as Emily said, we have plenty of time for your questions and comments. So I'll turn it over to Will to start the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Christine. So welcome back, everybody. I know some of you have heard this a few times, but it's good to start off, I think, each time just making sure that anybody that's joining that hasn't been joining other meetings here's a little bit about what we're talking about in the most basic sense when we talk about a clean heat standard. So details are, under consideration and discussion, but the basic concept is the clean heat standard will be a Department of Environmental Protection regulation. And it'd be a regulation that applies to heating energy suppliers. So that would be heating oil, propane, natural gas companies, possibly electricity. And the requirement would be to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by implementing clean heat. And implementing clean heat sounds like a general kind of requirement. For a standard, you need something very specific. So we're the kind of nuts and bolts of the regulation will be about how to meet this requirement using clean heat credits to document the use of clean heat. And so clean heat credits are what we use to sort of organize the accounting for clean heat, given the various different kinds of clean heat that may come in during the program. Next slide. So the topic today, and again, our topics here are listed, are based on a list that was submitted by some of our stakeholders for topics, is MassDEP coordination. We have a little less in sort of our background documents and comments on this topic from some of the others. So it's maybe a little short in the last couple of days, but just like as we've been doing, I'm going to present sort of what we have in our existing documents, and then Emily Lamb will be presenting the comments we've heard on the topic, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion. So as far as MassDEP coordination, we wanted to start with just a basic making sure people are clear what MassSave is. So MassSave is the name that our electric and gas utilities use to describe the way that they provide their energy efficiency services. So when you're getting rebates for weatherization and even electric heat pumps, that's through the MassSave program. And MassSave is important because, as the Clean Heat Commission report noted, right now they provide most of the funding for the decarbonization in the building sector. We think about our emissions as sectors, and the Clean Heat Standard is dealing with the heat used to heat buildings. So the other thing, and this is covered in our discussion document and also in a fair amount of detail in the appendix to Clean Energy and Climate Plan, the Clean Heat Standard is designed to complement other policies, including the MassSave program. And what it can do, in addition to the MassSave program, is put a long-term trajectory on the pace of installation of clean heat, so that we can make sure that over time we remain on the pace with the requirements of the 2030 CECP, and then even for the longer term, the 2050 CECP. Next slide. So again, turning it over to Emily with the caveat that she has the hard part here, which is characterizing stakeholder comments. So we have hundreds of pages of stakeholder comments that we thought it would be helpful to try and boil down in some of the key themes, but obviously we can't capture every part of it. So go ahead, Emily.
Sure. So commenters addressing MassSave really focused on two main areas, sort of methodological aspects, and then the topic of equity. On the methodology side, many commenters brought up using the existing methodologies within MassSave for evaluating energy savings and benefits that might be generated through the Clean Heat Standard. And then a few commenters brought up aligning the incentive levels within MassSave with the Clean Heat Standard goals, and designing the Clean Heat Standard to reach sectors of the energy market that are not currently covered in the MassSave programs. And then on the equity side, many commenters brought up specifically the concern of including protections for renters, because landlords could increase the price or increase rents after doing building improvements, such as installing a new heating system. And then also the topic of coordinating with stakeholders about some of the equity pitfalls that have happened in the MassSave program, to sort of learn from all of the efforts that have been underway there, was also raised. So I think we can go to the next slide, which will be back to Will.
Great, thanks, Emily. So as I said, we don't have a lot of material thus far on this topic. We appreciate stakeholders asking for this session, and we're looking forward to the questions and discussion. We did identify a couple things that might be good topics about sort of which elements of the Clean Heat Standard should we be coordinating with MassSave, and are there other outstanding questions or comments or discussion points on how that coordination can happen. So going to pause now, or open it up for questions and comments about this topic. Josh, it looks like we have a couple in the chat, I think.
Yeah, first a comment from Margaret Song. Just a note that MassSave also includes Cape Light Compact, which is not a utility, but it does offer energy efficiency programs under the umbrella of MassSave to Cape and Vineyard ratepayers.
Great, thank you for that clarification.
And then a question from Lisa Barrett. For projects being incentivized through MassSave, would the customer keep title to the credits, or would the utilities giving out the incentives keep the credits?
Right, so that's a good and important question, and we didn't get much comment on it, so I appreciate you raising it. That it is covered a little bit in the regulatory assistance projects appendix to the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. And the acknowledging that if credits are going to have value, there's going to need to be really specific rules about kind of ownership of the credits. And I think this is maybe mentioned in the Clean Heat Commission report also. I think the idea that's in those is that legally the owner of the property starts with the title to the credits for any work that's done on their property. But in practice, property owners, particularly single family homes, probably don't really want to be in the credit sort of markets. So most often they would somehow sign over the value to credits to the company that's doing the work. And how that interacts with MassSave, I think, is a great topic, and we haven't given much attention to. But I think the idea would be that throughout the program, the presumption is that the property owner would unless they signed it over somewhere else, hold title of the credit, but they would in most cases choose to do that. So it would be a matter of getting the documentation right. So again, but thanks for raising that. I'm very interested if other stakeholders have additional comments, either now or just as a reminder. We're happy to see another round of written comments in response to these meetings, hopefully by the end of August, if people can do that.
Kyle Murray, Acadia Center.
Thank you. So on that credit and coordination with the utilities question, I'd sort of also flip it around and say, how easy or difficult is it going to be for the utilities to coordinate all of these, residential credits? What processes are they going to have to set up on their end? Because, it might be, you check a box on a form that says we send over all our credits, or it might be it might be more complicated than that. So, I'd be interested in hearing how from the utilities about how difficult that process might be on their end.
I'll just give an initial reaction, but I too am happy to hear from others either now or in writing. I think we are in general concerned about complexity of the program, particularly at the customer kind of level, and particularly given the potential for multiple overlapping programs. One of the technical papers that we have posted online sort of talks about how different programs work as far as the needs and the visibility to of the market, and talks about some programs like the solar rooftop credit kind of thing might be one model where the homeowner does sometimes have some interface direct with the program, or maybe through an intermediary. Another example that's discussed in those is the ZEV crediting part of the zero emission vehicle standards programs, where the person involved in the vehicle purchase, there is a value to that credit that may be affecting the selling price of the vehicle. They don't actually interact with that. So it might be the signing off process is something that really kind of, whatever the complexity is, it at least moves it out of the customer's sort of list of things to try and understand. But I think this does get more complicated with the MassSave interaction. I appreciate your point that we will need to, and we already have a little bit started discussing the need to be interacting on this, how this all fits together.
I'm not seeing any raised hands or comments in the chat.
Pause a little more. We do have, I did anticipate we'd be a bit ahead of schedule, and we can do what we've done in the past, is go through the next part of the slides, and then sometimes that suggests another round of thoughts, but why don't we pause a minute more? So I think we'll continue on through the next half of the presentation now. So if we go to the next slide. So the other topic here we're looking at is measure verification, and we'll go through the same sort of sequence of discussion here. Next slide. So just to introduce measure verification, the word measure, this is one of the topics that was requested for a technical session. The word measure is the word that the MassDEP program uses for basically clean heat or other measures that are installed to affect energy use in buildings. The stakeholder discussion document does include some topics around verification, including the topic of third-party verifiers, which might apply to the crediting part of it or the reporting part of it. But the idea is you may need to have a third party that actually is hired to bring in independently the ability to make sure that the compliance requirements and the crediting requirements are being met. And although there can be a cost to third-party verification, to some extent, hiring verifiers or bringing independent verifiers in some ways can reduce some administrative burden, because it may mean that less information needs to be submitted to the department or other entities if there's a mechanism that has these verifiers looking at the information. And they can help to make sure that we're meeting the goals. Like there's a couple of specific examples, one of which we talked about quite a bit yesterday, where some ongoing verification may be needed. The hybrid electric and fossil heating system example was one that came up in yesterday's meeting. And then also blending of biofuels is something that would require monitoring if it was going to be credited, and that monitoring might involve the third-party verification requirement. The other thing that may merit some work in the verification area is we'll need to, as we've discussed in a couple of meetings, have a way of identifying credits that are meeting our equity goals. And so having a way of verifying that those credits are really representing projects that are consistent with those categories or different categories of credits that may be eligible for those equity kind of treatment, maybe another place where verification is important. Next slide. So we did identify a couple of verification related questions in our discussion document. One I kind of already talked about, the where and when third-party verification may be appropriate, and what specific requirements might be appropriate there. And then also overlapping some of the earlier discussions we've had, the need to define and identify credits that and verify really credits that support equitable outcomes. Next slide. Over to Emily.
Or yeah, so on the commenter side, many commenters sort of generally supported the concept of including measure verification within the program. And then many also raised the concept of how utility data could be useful in the verification process. And then a few commenters touched on these following more specific topics. So that aggregators could act as third-party verifiers, that verifiers could reduce the risk of fraud, the importance of maintaining consumer privacy, how verification must be regular and sort of consistent to be effective, to make sure that reporting or to acknowledge that reporting and verification could be administratively burdensome, and that verifiers should calculate reductions using an EPA or California standards. So with that, I think we can go to the next slide. Back to Will.
Great, thanks. So we have some specific questions that might elicit some more discussion now or some more written comments. And we obviously have some of this in the body of comments we have. What types of verification or cases would require verification? And particularly, are there any models that are out there that people think we should use either sort of as a whole or components of programs that have that are similar, that have similar verification requirements that we might look at. So I think we're back to another round of questions or comments.
One comment from Raymond Albrecht: perhaps there could be 2 levels of incentives for heat pumps, with higher levels offered for systems that are web enabled to allow utility control during peak periods, plus monitoring of power and usage. And perhaps the program could include on-bill financing of capital costs for all measures, whether heat pumps or renewable fuels, then credits are earned based on actual usage characteristics based on web-enabled control and monitoring. This could address the issue of verification.
Yeah, that's helpful, and I think that's one of the discussions, and it relates to something that was raised yesterday, because yesterday, I think it was in yesterday's meeting, someone mentioned that you might be able to learn something fairly reliable looking at monthly bills as far as documenting the use of clean heat. And so it's an interesting idea about the web enabled monitoring that might have, sub monitoring for heating systems and that sort of things. I think we'd have to look really carefully at whether that would be, a significant obstacle toward installations and crediting, and to agree it's necessary, but that is helpful to think about what the capabilities are there for sure.
Kyle Murray.
Yeah, I just was curious if DEP is working with a consultant on a lot of these questions, not just these, but what a lot of the technical sessions have been on, because a lot of these are very complex, complicated questions, as we all know, and having a consultant on a lot of these issues, an outside consultant, may be beneficial for the department and for the stakeholder process overall.
Yeah, that's helpful. And we don't have a specific direction on that. As you may notice, we do have some memoranda that we already commissioned from Synapse Energy Economics on our website that may, have some relation to this, and we do have them still on contract. I think where we are now is trying to get as much as we can from stakeholders, because we know that a lot of people have already given a lot of thought to this, but I think next steps as far as technical work is, that's certainly something we'll be thinking about as we move forward and think about what resources we need.
Just to add, we have hired technical consultants when we developed other programs like the Clean Energy Standard. So it's a model that we have used in the past. So stay tuned. We're still figuring all this out.
Joe Uglietto: the APS requires aggregations for the verification and reporting of liquid biofuels. Aggregators lower the administrative burden for the Department of Energy Resources and streamlines the reporting process. That could be an option for the Clean Heat Standard for delivering fuels, especially if the reporting and verification is coming from small businesses and end users.
That's helpful. I have a follow-up question, which is, would the idea be that there'd be a requirement to use aggregators, or are the benefits enough that it could be optional to use aggregators, do you think? And you don't have to answer now, but if you'd like to, that's fine. I'll just leave that out there as a question, but I hear the comment, and that's helpful. And we are also talking to our Department of Energy Resources about that program, and it's one of the things we're definitely aware of.
Ben Butterworth.
Yeah, thanks. One of the things I just want to flag, and we discussed, life cycle emissions from biofuels yesterday a bit. So, if you were to use, a model like GREET, for example, to measure life cycle emissions from biofuels, assuming that some biofuels were considered, eligible measure under the Clean Heat Standard. I just want to flag that there's there's the one part of verification that's talking about, you know, if we're talking about liquid biofuels, for example, kind of what is the mix of liquid biofuels? Like, you know, where are those coming from? What, you know, what's derived from food waste, what's derived from other sources, et cetera. So there's like the kind of the streams question. But then there's the question of also kind of continuously updating the life cycle emissions model that you're basing the emissions reductions from those biofuels on, because they aren't kind of static fixed numbers. Like we talked about a little bit yesterday, the emissions reductions associated with the use of a biofuel are highly dependent on what counterfactual you're assuming, and the counterfactual is constantly changing. So just an area to flag that is a significant effort and a significant lift to kind of constantly be updating the life cycle emissions factors associated with various types of biofuels. It's not just like a do it once and kind of set it and forget it type thing. So just something I want to bring up.
That's helpful. And I will say, I do think we're looking for options to make the program at least somewhat simpler than the California low carbon fuel standard, as far as the detailed reliance on needing to verify a lot of different variables related to biofuels in particular. But the comment is certainly well taken, and that's helpful.
We have a follow-up to your question, Will, from Joe Uglietto. The APS requires aggregations, which is helpful for not only marketing the program, but also for reporting. Additionally, trading of a small volume of credits in these OTC markets is a difficult process and normally would result in a discounted value. I would suggest mandating the use of aggregations in the Clean Heat Standard.
Great, thanks. Very helpful. Anything else? We'll say this is not entirely unexpected. If we finish a little early, we did notice with these topics that there was some overlap among them, and did put this one last to make sure we had time for, you know, if we had extra questions from the previous days or other questions, we're happy to go with them. But if last call for questions and comments on this particular topic.
Joe, I've asked you to unmute.
Great, thanks. I was hoping you could expand a little on the coordination of MassSAVE, the Clean Heat Standard, and the APS, and how you see all three of those programs potentially working together. You know, whether you'd give an incentive in the, you know, if a homeowner installs a heat pump, are you giving an incentive in the Clean Heat Standard, MassSAVE rebate, and an incentive in the APS program? Kind of what would happen to the APS program if Clean Heat Standard went into place, because there are so many overlapping technologies on the generation side. So if there's any more info you could give on your thought process there, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the topics we're looking for input on. I think the Clean Heat Commission and other documents have suggested that the APS, you know, might become less important over time as this comes into play. We're not quite far along enough with this to really think through that part of it, and it's not, you know, obviously we need to coordinate, but that's not a part of the current DP mandate to solve that problem. I'd also say that the MassSAVE part of it, I think, is a slightly, so that's a noted your comment, and I just don't have an answer to it right now. The MassSAVE part, I'd make a slightly different observation, which is that you know, I mentioned the zero emission vehicle crediting program that, you know, does affect the purchase price of electric vehicles, but there's also tax credits on top of those. Point being that having multiple programs that affect the same outcome isn't, you know, something that's necessarily bad or not needed. So we'd want to look at it from that standpoint too. Maybe these are, you know, maybe there should be an additional point. And the last thing is that, and I've heard you point this out before and others, and this is correct. So I'll acknowledge the devil is in the details here, but one of the things that's documented in the regulatory system project report is that this may be able to function as somewhat of a sort of a blanket program where things that are happening in other programs do count toward compliance, but the other programs can continue. Sort of like with DEP has a clean energy standard where compliance with the renewable portfolio standard is part of it. So that might be another model we'll look at. So I'm just suggesting there's different ways in which things might fit together and a number of possibilities.
Great, thank you.
I guess the other thing I'd say, we are also looking at the APS program in relation to this particular meeting with full understanding that people have spent a significant amount of time just understanding the basic rules and requirements under that program, aggregators being an example. And so having some consistency in how we start up with this program on the technical pieces would be helpful, regardless of the future of the APS program.
Raymond Albrecht has a two-part question. What are your plans for including industrial and institutional facilities?
So we, so moving on. So, as I said, I think it sounds like we might have sort of exhausted the questions that are particular to this particular topic, and we don't want to go too far with this, but I think we're happy to take some sort of more general questions. I think that the general thinking now is that even in Massachusetts, for a lot of what you might call industrial institutional facilities, a lot of the combustion is for heating purposes and still really under the purview of a clean heat standard. We'd be interested in hearing, and we haven't heard too much yet about whether there are important exceptions to that of things that where they're on the natural gas or even using what we call heating oil, but the usage is specifically not something that really matches heating. And that I should say also, we do think that the heating we're ultimately going to need to cover and include the requirements. There's no way to separate out things like fuel used for cooking or water heating. But that said, there might be particular industrial situations, is what I'm saying, that do merit a closer look.
And then the second question from Raymond, also credits for thermal output from large combined heat and power systems that use renewable fuels.
Yeah, that's another question that I don't have an answer to at this point, but one we're going to have to take a real specific look at. All right. We could go on to the next slide. So less important than the previous two meetings, but this is what we've been through this week. I'll remind you, these are topics that were requested by stakeholders. We don't believe we've resolved these by any means, but the main purpose of this initial round of stakeholder comment is to just hear from, we know a lot of people have done a lot of thinking about this already, and hear from those thoughts. So next slide. So as we said before, we're always open for questions and comments. Happy to meet with people on request. And we hope you're all already signed up for our email list, but if you haven't yet, here's the address. I think we're finished. Christine, I didn't know if you wanted to add any last minute thoughts or not.
No, just thank you for everyone for joining us over the last 3 days. I think we've heard a lot of great comments and very much responsive to what we were hoping for. And just one pitch on the email list, if you know of folks that we should be reaching out to, please let us know. I'll add them to the list because we want to make sure we have input from all stakeholders and interested parties. And with that, again, this session will be recorded. It will be on our website. folks to be able to look at later. If they weren't able to attend, they can look at it too. So with that, I think we're finished for today.
Great, thank you, everybody.